Carol Whitmore was 56 years old when she signed the papers that ended her marriage. She signed them at a conference table in her attorney's office on a Tuesday in March, with a pen that ran dry halfway through the second page and had to be replaced, while sleet came down in thin gray sheets against the parking lot window behind her attorney's head. She did not cry. She had done most of her crying the previous October, alone in her car in the parking lot of a Harris Teeter, after a phone call with her daughter that had confirmed what Carol had already understood for weeks. The marriage was not failing. It was already finished. It had been finished by someone else, without her being consulted, and what remained now was paperwork. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had known Richard Whitmore since she was 27 years old. They met at a county fair outside Harlan on a Thursday evening in August, the kind of fair that smells of diesel generators and funnel cake and horses, the kind Carol's cousin Tressa dragged her to because Tressa wanted to see a man who was going to be there and did not want to go alone. Richard was standing near a fence post with a paper plate, eating powdered sugar off his thumb with an expression of complete satisfaction, and he laughed at something Carol said before she even finished the sentence. Not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden and a little loud, and he looked at her like she had surprised him. He had a way of listening where he seemed to lean toward you even when he wasn't physically moving, a quality of attention she had never seen in anyone before. She noticed it that first evening. She never once stopped noticing it in the 29 years that followed. They married when she was 29 and he was 31. He brought a pickup truck and a used commercial mower and a bank loan he had already applied for on the assumption that she would say yes. She brought furniture from a storage unit, a portable set of bookkeeping skills she had spent 3 years building while working for her uncle's plumbing company, and a willingness to outwork everyone in whatever room she was in. Within 3 years, they had Whitmore Landscaping operating out of a rented lot on the east side of Harlan, with 2 employees and a second truck. Within 10 years, it was a company of 14 people with its own warehouse space, a small fleet of specialized equipment, and 3 commercial contracts with Harlan County itself. Carol had kept the books through those first 8 years, answered every phone call, met clients at job sites when Richard couldn't, driven a flatbed trailer across the county on days when crew members called in sick. She had done all of that, and also raised their 2 children, Brent and then Allison 2 years later, and managed the house on Clover Ridge Road with its 3 bedrooms and wraparound porch, and the garden she planted from seed every March and tended through October without needing to be asked. Her name was not on the business. This had seemed, at the time, like an administrative detail. It had not felt significant. It had not felt like anything at all. In the fall of her 55th year, she picked up Richard's phone from the kitchen counter while he was upstairs in the shower. She thought it was hers. The name on the screen was Dina. The message beneath it was not one Carol was meant to read. She set the phone back on the counter exactly where she had found it. She went and sat in one of the kitchen chairs. She sat there without moving until she heard the water shut off upstairs. Richard came down in his work clothes and found her, and his face moved through a sequence of expressions that she watched with the strange calm of someone watching something happen that has already been decided. He sat across from her at the table. The conversation lasted 4 hours. He cried twice and apologized once. He said it had started 18 months ago, that it had never been serious in the way he knew she was thinking, that he had been intending to end it. He said things about pressure and distance, and a period 2 years back when he had felt like he was losing himself, and Carol listened to all of it. She sat in the chair she had sat in for 21 years of breakfasts and Sunday mornings and listened to her husband explain, carefully and with evident pain, how a person learns to maintain 2 parallel lives simultaneously without either one of them registering in his face when he walks through the front door. She asked him to leave when he ran out of things to say. He left. By the end of the following week, he had hired an attorney named Fitzgerald. The divorce took 11 months. Carol had believed, with the particular faith of someone who has not thought through what happens if the belief is wrong, that 29 years of shared work counted for something concrete when assets were divided by a court. Richard's attorney argued efficiently that Carol's contributions to the business were difficult to establish in legal terms. She had not been listed as a partner. Her involvement in operations had been informal and undocumented. The bookkeeping had ended a decade prior when Richard had hired an accountant. What remained, Fitzgerald said across a mediation table with the ease of a man who had said versions of this many times before, was the general domestic support any spouse might provide, which courts did not typically translate into a percentage of a business's equity. Carol's own attorney, a woman who billed in 6-minute increments and was therefore always slightly hurried, told her plainly that fighting for half of Whitmore landscaping at trial would cost more in fees than she was likely to recover in the outcome. The marital home on Clover Ridge Road carried 9 years of mortgage remaining on it. Richard's offer was to assume that mortgage entirely, keeping the house, if Carol released any claim on the business. She took the deal. She did not feel that she had a better option available to her. She was 56 years old. She had been out of the formal workforce for over a decade in any capacity that showed on paper, and she had 3 boxes of personal belongings and a car. She walked out of the Harlan County Courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in March with $47,000 from the liquidation of their joint savings account, a 2017 Honda CR-V with 84,000 miles on it, those 3 boxes, and Brent, who had driven 4 hours from Nashville to help her carry them to the car the weekend before. He had said the right things in the parking lot of the house on Clover Ridge Road while he loaded the boxes. He was sorry. She didn't deserve this. She should call him any time. He lived 4 hours away with a mortgage of his own and a life that was already full, and Carol understood, without either of them having to say so, that there was a limit to what that kind of help could look like in practice. Allison called twice in the week after the finalization. Both calls drifted, in the middle of them, toward Richard. How he was doing. Whether he seemed okay. Allison was not defending him. She was 28 and she was processing, and Carol understood that too. Carol tried to have patience for it. She rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Harlan above a laundromat on Mount Street. The apartment had a bathroom fan that ran continuously, a window in the bedroom that faced directly into the brick wall of the neighboring building, and a smell of fabric softener that came up through the floor on the days when the machines below were busy. She furnished it with what she could carry in the CR-V and a kitchen chair she found at the Salvation Army on Campbell Street for $6. Most evenings she sat in that chair and ate soup heated on the 2-burner stove and ran numbers in a spiral notebook she bought at the drugstore. She subtracted rent from the $47,000, then insurance, then what the CR-V cost her per month, then groceries at the level she was eating them, which was not much. The number that remained each time was different from the number she wanted to see. She applied for 3 jobs in her first month. An insurance office on Cumberland Avenue interviewed her and did not call back. A law firm did not respond to her application at all. A garden center on the edge of town offered her part-time hours at $12.50 an hour. She accepted. She knew plants from 3 decades of tending her own, and she needed a reason to be somewhere each day that was not the apartment. She was 3 weeks into the garden center work when her mother's sister died in Pike County General Hospital. Vera Sutton had been 78 years old and had apparently been ill for some time before she told anyone, which was consistent with everything Carol knew about her. Vera had lived alone on 43 acres south of Pikeville for 41 years, never married, never had children, and had spent her adult life in a self-contained solitude that the rest of the family found equal parts admirable and baffling. She tended her land. She grew an orchard of pears and apples she had planted in stages across sloping ground over 20 years of careful work. She did not attend family gatherings unless she wanted to, and she rarely wanted to. Carol had liked her more than she had ever gotten around to saying out loud, and now she would not get the chance to say it. The attorney handling Vera's estate called Carol on a Wednesday afternoon while she was repotting begonias in the back greenhouse. She stepped out into the parking lot to hear him clearly over the greenhouse fans. Vera had left her the land. All 43 acres, the farmhouse, the detached barn, and a spring-fed pond on the eastern edge of the property. The attorney's tone, as he delivered this news, was the careful, neutral tone of someone who also needs to tell you something else. The previous October had been one of the wettest in Pike County's recorded history. A tributary of the Lavisa Fork had broken its banks repeatedly across 3 weeks of near-continuous rainfall. The lower third of Vera's orchard, the oldest trees, the one she had planted when she first arrived on the land, had been submerged for 11 consecutive days. The barn's stone foundation had shifted along its eastern wall. The spring-fed pond had expanded across its banks and swallowed a section of the property's internal access road. The farmhouse itself sat on a gentle rise and had escaped interior flooding, but moisture had worked its way into the lower walls, and the cellar had flooded and then reseeded and left behind a growth of mold that Vera had not lived long enough to treat. A property assessor had estimated the remediation costs at somewhere between $18,000 and $31,000, depending on how many of the flooded trees could be brought back. The land's value, undamaged, would have been in the range of $220,000. With the damage factored in, the assessor's report stated that the current marketable value was, and Carol read this phrase 3 times to be certain she had it right, difficult to determine. She drove out to see the property on a Saturday in late April, the CRV loaded with a thermos of coffee and a spiral notebook. Her GPS sent her wrong twice before she found the gravel road. She pulled to the edge of the property just before 11 in the morning and stood outside the car in the pale spring light and looked. The orchard ran down the hillside in rows that curved gently with the slope of the land. The trees were pale and stripped-looking, still carrying the exhausted quality of plants that had stood for too long in water they could not drink. The grass between the rows lay flat and matted, pressed into the earth by the weight of the flood and not yet recovered enough to stand back up. At the far end of the field, the barn sat with its left wall leaning outward at an angle just visible enough to be worrying, and one of its large wooden doors hanging from a bent upper hinge. Beyond the barn, where the access road should have continued through to the eastern edge of the property, the expanded pond sat wide and silver in the morning light, its new banks eating into the roadbed. The farmhouse was stone and hand-cut timber, built in the early 1900s by someone who had intended it to last. It had the look of a building that has absorbed a great deal over a long time and intends to absorb a great deal more. The porch sagged at its southeast corner. The windows were layered with grime. The chimney had lost a course of brick near the top, and the gap in the stack showed clearly against the gray sky, open to the weather. Carol stood at the edge of the muddy field and took all of it in. Then she walked toward the house. Inside, the smell reached her before anything else: cold stone and damp wood, and underneath those, something older and harder to describe, the particular smell that belongs to buildings that have been sealed against weather for long stretches of time. She moved from room to room without hurrying. The kitchen had an iron wood-burning stove with a water reservoir built into its side and a table of thick pine boards so long it could only have been assembled in the room, because no door in the house was wide enough to have admitted it from outside. The main room had a stone fireplace and 2 windows facing west across the slope of the orchard. Upstairs, 2 small bedrooms, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub standing on feet rusted to a deep copper brown. She found the cellar door in the kitchen floor, nearly covered by a braided rug that had fused itself to the floorboards through years of absorbed moisture. She worked the rug aside and found wide oak planks set in a frame with an iron ring pull. The wood had swollen in its frame with the cold and the damp. She gripped the ring with both hands and pulled, and the door held for a moment, then released with a sound like something exhaling after a very long time of holding its breath. Cold air came up from below. At the base of the steep wooden stairs, she could see the water line on the stone walls, a clear mark 4 inches from the earthen floor, and above it, working upward through the mortar between the stones in slow patches, a growth of gray-white mold. She did not go down. She stood at the top of the stairs with her hand on the door frame and looked into the dark below and thought, for a long moment, about Vera, about a woman who had stood in this same kitchen for 41 years, about what it meant to look at a piece of land like this one and see something that other people had looked at and walked past, and to stay. She pulled the door closed and sat at the pine table and finished her coffee and listened to the house settle around her in the afternoon quiet. By the time she drove back to Harlan that evening, her decision was made. Brent, when she told him, went quiet in the way he had inherited from his father and asked how much the repairs would cost and whether she was certain about this. She told him she was not certain about anything at all, but she was doing it. Allison said it sounded really hard, and then, in nearly the same breath, mentioned she had spoken with her father recently and that he seemed to be adjusting. Carol let that pass without comment. Mavis Chun worked the next bench over at the garden center. She had become, without either of them consciously deciding it, the closest thing Carol had to a real friend since the divorce. When Carol showed her the pictures on her phone, the pale trees, the listing barn, the swollen cellar door, Mavis looked at each one carefully and then said, with the warmth of someone who means what they say, "You know what that orchard needs? Same thing you need. To be left alone long enough to figure out it's still alive." It was the first time Carol had laughed, a real laugh, in months. Word about the inheritance moved through the small professional community of Harlan with the speed that only bad news travels. She learned later that Richard had found the assessor's report and mentioned it at the office, and it had spread from there. A man she vaguely recognized from the county's landscaping world stopped her in the garden center parking lot to ask if it was true she'd taken on some flooded property in Pike County. When she said yes, he shook his head slowly in the way people shake their heads when they believe they already know the ending. "Rough break," he said. "Flood-damaged orchard's about as useful as a swimming pool that only fills when you don't want it." He chuckled at his own joke. She smiled and kept moving. She gave her notice at the garden center. She returned the apartment keys on a Friday morning. She packed the CRV with everything that belonged to her, which fit with room to spare, and she drove south on a Thursday morning in May with the windows down and her thermos between the seats. The gravel road into the property was soft from the spring rains. Old trees grew close on both sides, their roots running deep into the same ground that Vera's orchard roots ran through, ground that had been absorbing this county's weather for a very long time. She parked in front of the farmhouse in the late afternoon when the light came low and golden through the orchard above, touching the tops of the trees and making the upper branches, the ones that had not drowned, look almost warm. She made up the brass bed in the smaller upstairs bedroom with her own sheets and opened the window 3 inches for air. Evening came in cool through the gap, carrying the smell of wet soil and pear wood and the pond somewhere east of the barn. She lay on the old mattress and listened to the house breathe around her. The stone walls held the day's warmth longer than she expected. Something moved in the eaves, a bird settling in for the night, or a squirrel that had claimed the space years before she arrived and would need to be negotiated with later. Through the window came the sound of the pond, just audible, and from the lower orchard, the soft, irregular knock of branches moving in the evening wind. She thought about the cellar door and the dark below it. She thought about 11 days of standing water and mold climbing stone walls and $31,000 she did not have. She thought about Vera, who had worked this ground alone and found it sufficient. The room went dark around her slowly, the way rooms do in old farmhouses with no electricity, the light leaving gradually as though it has somewhere else to be and is in no hurry. Carol closed her eyes. For the first time in 7 months, she slept through the night without waking. She started the cellar work at first light the next morning. She had stopped in Dorton on her way in the day before a small town 7 miles down the main road and found a hardware store run by a man named Earl Perkins who appeared to be close to 70 and who rang up her supplies without commentary until he reached the end of the transaction and said, more to himself than to her, "You're the one that took on the Sutton property." When she confirmed this, he studied her for a moment and then said, "Good land. Just had a hard year." He had a used dehumidifier in the back room that worked reliably, he said, and sold it to her for $40. The cellar was roughly 15 by 20 feet, stone-walled on 3 sides, with the base of the farmhouse's main chimney rising through the rear wall's center. The floor was hard-packed earth. The floodwater had soaked into it rather than pooling and draining the way it would have on poured concrete, which meant the moisture had been releasing slowly into the air of the space for months, feeding the mold. She put on her respirator, pulled on the rubber gloves, and started at the top of the mold damage and worked down, section by section, wall by wall. 3 days of that. On the first day, she cataloged everything. On the second, she cleaned. On the third, she ran the dehumidifier and worked through the space again, checking what the first treatment had missed. It was on the third day, while she was sweeping debris from the treated walls away from the base of the masonry, working her way around the chimney base toward the rear corner where the airflow was worst, that she noticed the discrepancy. The rear wall behind the chimney base was not the same depth on both sides. On the left, the masonry ran clean and flat from the chimney to the corner. On the right, there was a thickening in the stonework, a slight angling of the wall face that did not resolve into a clean corner the way the other 3 corners did. She had moved past it twice on the second day without registering it as more than old construction settling unevenly. Then she moved the dehumidifier to sweep the floor behind it. Set into the face of that thickened section of masonry, at a height of about 4 feet from the ground, almost perfectly flush with the surrounding stone, was an iron plate roughly the size of a hardcover book. Its surface was dark with age and coated in the same mineral deposit that covered every other stone surface in the cellar. She would not have seen it if she had not been standing directly in front of it with a flashlight held low. At the plate's center was a keyhole. Carol crouched in front of it and held the flashlight beam steady on that small, precise opening. The deposit on the plate's surface had been building over years, decades possibly, long enough to obscure all but the faintest outline of the plate itself. The masonry around it had been laid as part of the original construction. This was not a later addition, not something installed by Vera or by whoever owned the property before her. This had been here since the house was built, set into the wall and sealed into it, and either left there intentionally or forgotten so completely that no one who had lived on this land since had thought to mention it. She held the light on it for a long time. Then she stood up, turned off the dehumidifier, carried her supplies upstairs, and stood at the kitchen window looking out over the orchard. The upper trees, the ones that had survived the flood, were showing the pale green of new leaves coming in. Down the slope, the damaged trees were harder to read. Some of them showed the faintest signs of life at their branch tips, and some of them showed nothing at all. She would need to find out which was which. But first, she needed to find something else. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote the date. Beneath it, she wrote 4 words. Find the key. Search the house. Somewhere in this farmhouse, or somewhere on these 43 acres, there was a key that belonged to a lock that had been waiting in the dark of that cellar for longer than Carol Whitmore had been alive. She was going to find it. The search began the way all serious searches begin, with the obvious places first, and the slow understanding that the obvious places are rarely where anything meaningful is hidden. She started with the farmhouse itself, moving room by room in the methodical way she had learned during the cellar work, checking everything that could be opened, every drawer and cabinet and built-in shelf, every surface that might conceal something beneath it. The kitchen yielded 3 drawers of rusted utensils, a tin of buttons sorted by color, and a collection of seed packets so old the paper had gone translucent. The living room had a built-in cabinet beside the fireplace that was stuck fast with old paint and took her 20 minutes with a chisel and a mallet to open. Inside, she found 8 years of Farm Bureau newsletters from the 1970s and a stack of dishes wrapped in newspaper from 1968. The upstairs rooms had their own quiet secrets of age and accumulated life, a pressed flower in a Bible with no name written inside, a child's shoe under a floorboard that had partially lifted but nothing that looked like it belonged to a lock she had already found. She was thorough and she was patient, and at the end of the 3rd full day of searching, she sat at the pine table with a cup of tea and admitted to herself that the key was not in any of the places she had thought to look. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote down what she knew. The iron plate was original to the construction. She had photographed it and described the lock to Earl Perkins on her next trip into Dorton, and Earl had studied the photograph for a long moment before setting her phone down on the counter. "Barrel lock," he said. "Old style. Haven't seen one of those in a long while." He estimated it dated to somewhere between 1910 and 1930, consistent with the age of the house. Whoever had set that plate into the masonry had done it when the farmhouse was built, or very soon after. Earl had known more than she expected. He had grown up in Dorton and had known Vera Sutton in the way that people who live within a few miles of each other in a rural county know one another. Not closely, but solidly, with a clear sense of who someone is. He said Vera had purchased the property in 1983 from the estate of a man named Harlan Sutton, no relation to Vera that Earl was aware of, though the name coincidence was the sort of thing that happened more often than people expected in that part of Pike County. Harlan Sutton had inherited the property from his father, a man named Elias Sutton, who had built the farmhouse around 1918. Elias Sutton. Carol wrote the name at the top of a clean page and underlined it. Earl said his knowledge of Elias was limited to what the county had recorded and what his own father had mentioned once or twice in passing. Elias had been a private man. He worked the land, grew apples and pears, kept to himself, and had died in 1961. What Earl's father had mentioned specifically, and Earl remembered it because the detail had struck him as odd, was that Elias had spent the winter of 1943 doing something to the lower floor of his farmhouse. Nobody had known what. He had turned away 2 men who had come to offer help. The following spring, He had sealed off the old cellar access and relocated the entrance to where it sat now, through the kitchen floor, without explanation. Carol looked at what she had written. 1943. Winter. She thought about what 1943 had been in America, and what a private man working alone through a cold season in Pike County might have been doing in the lower floor of his house, while the rest of the world was occupied elsewhere. She drove to the Pike County Public Library in Pikeville the following Tuesday, and spent 4 hours at the microfilm machines and at a computer terminal, pulling every document she could find attached to Elias Sutton's name. What came back was then a marriage certificate from 1921, the original land deed from 1918, property tax records that continued through the 1950s, his death record from 1961. No children. His wife Helen appeared in records through 1931 and not after that, and Carol could not determine whether she had died or left. There were no photographs, no letters in any archive she could access. What she did find, in the Pike County deed and court records for 1943, was a land dispute. A company called Mountain Valley Resource Partners had filed a claim against Elias Sutton's property in September of that year, alleging that a mineral rights agreement signed in 1919 entitled them to access and extraction rights across 30 acres of his 43. The case had moved through the county court system for 2 years. In October of 1945, the circuit court had ruled in Sutton's favor. The ruling itself was archived only as a summary line in the clerk's records, but what that line said was specific. The court found in favor of the defendant based on documentation produced by the defendant at the final hearing that the opposing counsel had been unable to refute or discredit. Documentation that Elias Sutton had apparently assembled in the winter of 1943, working alone in his cellar, turning away anyone who came to help. Carol sat at the library terminal for a long time after reading that. She drove back to the property in the late afternoon and walked the orchard rows until the light went. The upper trees were well into their spring growth, the pear blossoms fully out, small and white and faintly sweet in the evening air. Down the slope, the flood-damaged trees were showing her more than her first assessment had suggested. Several she had marked as lost were producing tentative new leaf growth at their branch tips, tight and green and unambiguous. They were not all going to survive, but more of them were alive than she had originally thought. She stopped at the bottom of the lower section and looked back up toward the farmhouse. The stone walls held the last of the light. The chimney showed its gap against the sky. She had been on the property for 6 weeks. In that time, she had treated the cellar mold, replaced damaged siding on the barn's eastern wall, shimmed the porch corner level, and had begun working through the flood-damaged trees methodically, cutting away dead wood, and assessing each trunk for signs of life. She had also gone through every room of the farmhouse again, twice, looking for a key that matched a barrel lock from approximately 1918 to 1930. She had found keys, 3 of them, in different locations around the house, and one at the back of the utensil drawer, one on a nail inside the barn's feed room, one wrapped in a square of cloth inside a tin box on the top shelf of the living room cabinet. None of them were barrel keys. They were standard skeleton keys of various sizes, the kind that belonged to old door locks and padlocks. Nothing unusual about any of them. She had not yet opened the iron plate. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She told herself this was because she hadn't found the right key. The less comfortable truth was that she was also afraid of what she might not find, that the plate would swing open on an empty chamber or on something ordinary and long since spoiled, and that the particular quality of hope she had been carrying for 6 weeks would have to be set down somewhere and left behind. On the 43rd day on the property, she heard from Richard. Not directly. The call came from Allison, who opened it by asking how things were going and then, 3 minutes in, mentioned that her father had been asking about the land again. He had apparently spoken to someone at a bank in Pikeville about whether flood-damaged orchard property had any realistic recovery potential. The contact had told him, Allison reported with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information she isn't certain she should be delivering, that without significant remediation investment the land would be difficult to move at any reasonable valuation. Richard had apparently found this satisfying. He had described the situation, according to Allison, as unfortunate. Carol thanked her daughter for calling. After she hung up, she stood at the kitchen window looking at the orchard for a while. The pear blossoms had come in fully now, white against the May sky, and the morning light was moving across the upper rows in a way that made the whole hillside look briefly and impossibly clean. She thought about the word unfortunate. She thought about what it cost a person to look at someone else's difficulty and settle on that particular word for it. Then she turned back to the stove, because the water in the reservoir needed topping up, and she was almost out of the tea she had been drinking through the morning. The stove's water reservoir was a rectangular iron tank bolted to the firebox's side, designed to heat water slowly from the stove's warmth throughout the day. It had a hinged lid on top and a spigot at the bottom. Carol had been using it since her first week on the property, filling it from the pump at the kitchen sink each morning, drawing from it through the day for washing up and for tea. She had cleaned it once, in her third week, when a mineral residue had started to build along the interior walls. She had reached in then with a cloth and worked her way around the inside of the tank. She opened the lid now to check the water level, as she had done dozens of times before. The water was low. She could see the bottom of the reservoir clearly through the warm water. And resting there, partially obscured by the mineral deposit along the tank's interior, was something that should not have been there. She reached in. The water was warm against her hand and wrist. Her fingers found an object on the bottom and closed around it. Something small, hard, smooth where it was not pitted with age. She lifted it out and held it in her open palm. It was a key, a barrel key, the type used in older lever locks, with a long cylindrical shaft and a small, precisely cut bit at its working end. The iron was dark with age and stained by the minerals in the water, but the shape of it was unmistakable the moment she knew what she was looking at. She carried it to the kitchen window and held it in the light. Along the barrel, barely visible through the mineral staining, were two letters stamped into the iron in a plain block typeface. E.S. Carol stood at the window with the key in her palm and the May sun coming in warm across the pine table, and she did not move for a long time. He had put it in the water reservoir, in the one place on the property that someone would use without thinking every day, that would be emptied and refilled on a regular basis, that water would pass through and mineral deposits would slowly coat over years and decades, that no one would reach to the bottom of unless they were tending the stove the way someone who intended to stay would tend it. He had not hidden the key for it to be found by accident. He had hidden it to be found by someone who lived in the house properly, who used the stove and heated the water and cleaned the tank the way a person who had committed to the place would do. She set the key on the pine table and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook. She had the key. She had the lock. She had the name of the man who had built the room and sealed it in the winter of 1943 while a company attempted to take 30 acres of his land through the courts. She had the record of a land dispute that Elias Sutton had won with documentation he had assembled alone in the cellar of this house during that same winter. Whatever he had built down there, whatever he had locked behind that iron plate, it had been enough to end a 2-year legal fight, and it had been waiting in the dark ever since. She carried the key downstairs. The cellar was cool and smelled of clean stone now, the dehumidifier smell gone along with the mold, the air dry enough that she no longer needed to keep a window open above the stairwell. She moved to the rear corner, past the chimney base, and crouched in front of the iron plate. In the beam of her flashlight, the plate's surface showed the same dark patina it always had, mineral-coated, almost flush with the surrounding masonry, invisible to anyone not looking for it. She fitted the key to the lock. It entered the keyhole with a sound that was different from any wrong key trying to find purchase. A clean, settling sound. The sound of exact fit. She held it there. 60 years and more. The winter of 1943. A man working alone down here while a resource company filed papers in the county courthouse. Whatever he had put behind this plate, he had not put it there without reason, and he had not hidden the key from everyone. He had hidden it from the wrong people and left it where the right person would eventually find it. Vera had stayed 41 years and had never cleaned the reservoir, or had cleaned it without reaching all the way to the bottom, or had found the key and understood something Carol did not yet understand about why it had been left. And Vera had left the land to Carol. Carol turned the key. The resistance was significant. The mechanism had not moved in decades, and it fought her for a moment, dry and stiff, and then something shifted deep in the plate, and she felt it in her hand before she heard it. A solid, unhurried click. The plate moved. not a door. She had imagined a door. What swung toward her on a hinge was the face of a drawer built into the masonry, roughly 8 inches deep. Its inner walls carefully finished, not rough stone, but smoothed and lined with a layer of heavy oilcloth still intact, still sealed against the damp of the surrounding stone. Inside the drawer, protected by the oilcloth and the iron and 60 years of cold dark, was a collection of objects she had not been prepared for. A metal document box with a clasp lid, roughly 12 inches long, its surface dark with age, but its form intact and undamaged. Beneath it, 3 cloth bags tied with cord, each approximately the size of a large fist. She lifted one carefully and felt the weight of it distribute in her hand, dense, settling, the particular weight of metal. And resting on top of the document box, against the oilcloth, a single envelope. The wax seal on its flap had darkened with age but had not cracked. It was addressed in a hand that was careful and deliberate and unhurried, as if the writer had given himself time to get it right. 2 words and no name. To whoever stays. Carol sat back on the cold floor of the cellar and looked at what Elias Sutton had placed in this drawer 63 years ago, or thereabouts, working alone through a Pike County winter while a company's lawyers built their case in the courthouse. She looked at the document box. She looked at the 3 cloth bags. She looked at the envelope. To whoever stays. She thought about Vera, who had worked this land for 41 years and left it to Carol. She thought about the flooded trees at the bottom of the orchard, the ones she had been ready to write off, pushing up new leaf growth at their tips in the May light. She thought about the key at the bottom of the water reservoir, sitting there through every filling and every drawing down, waiting for someone to reach all the way to the bottom. She thought about Richard, who had looked at this land during the divorce proceedings and seen something not worth fighting over. She thought about the word unfortunate. Her hands were not entirely steady when she picked up the envelope. She turned it over. The wax seal was intact, a plain impression, no monogram, just the mark of a thumb pressed into warm wax by a man who had wanted to make sure this arrived undisturbed. She worked a finger under the flap carefully, along the edge, breaking the seal without tearing the paper. Inside was a single folded sheet. The handwriting was the same careful hand as the address on the envelope, unhurried, deliberate, written by someone who had thought about what he wanted to say before he picked up the pen. She read it once through. Then she read it again. Outside, somewhere above her, the house settled in the afternoon quiet. A bird called once from the orchard, then went silent. The May light would be moving across the upper rows of trees right now, touching the blossoms, warming the stone walls, falling across the pine table in the kitchen where the key had been sitting in its pan of water for longer than anyone living had known. Carol sat on the cellar floor with the letter in her hands and read it a 3rd time. Then she set it down beside the document box and the cloth bags and looked at all of it together. And for the first time since she had driven south on that Thursday morning in May with everything she owned in a CRV with 84,000 miles on it, she allowed herself to think clearly about what this might mean. Not for the property, not for the land assessment or the remediation costs or the damaged trees or the shifted barn foundation. For her. For what came after 56 years of building something and watching it be divided by a man named Fitzgerald with a pen that didn't run out of ink. She sat with it for a long time. Then she reached for the document box and opened the clasp. The document box opened on a hinge that had stiffened with age but gave without breaking. Inside, packed carefully and wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth that had preserved them from the damp, were papers. Not a few pages. A full organized stack of them, filed with the deliberate care of someone who knew they might not be present to explain the order. Carol lifted the oilcloth wrapper aside and began working through what was there. The first document was a land survey, hand-drawn on heavy paper, dated September 1917, stamped with the seal of a surveying firm out of Pikeville. It showed the 43 acres of the Sutton property in precise detail, every boundary, every elevation line, every topographic feature rendered in ink that had faded to brown but remained entirely legible. Carol recognized the shape of the land immediately from her own walks across it. There was the slope of the orchard. There was the rise where the farmhouse sat. There was the eastern edge where the pond now sat wider than the map showed it. And in the lower left quadrant of the survey, marked with a notation she had to hold the flashlight close to read, was a symbol she did not immediately recognize, a circle with a horizontal line through it. repeated at 3 points across the lower section of the property, with connecting lines that ran beneath the topography marks like veins beneath skin. Beside the symbol, in ink that was a slightly different shade from the rest, as if added in a separate sitting, was a single handwritten word. Artesian. Carol set the survey down and picked up the next document. It was a letter, dated March 1941, addressed to Elias Sutton at this property's address, from a man identified in the letterhead as Dr. C. W. Ferris, Associate Professor of Geology at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. The letter ran to 2 pages and was technical in places, but Carol read it through twice, and by the end she had understood the substance of what it said. Dr. Ferris had visited the property in February of that year, at Elias Sutton's request, to assess an underground water feature that Elias had identified the previous summer. During an extended drought, the lowest section of the orchard had remained wet while everything above it dried out. Dr. Ferris wrote that his assessment confirmed what the observation suggested. Beneath the lower 40% of the Sutton property ran a natural artesian aquifer system, a pressurized body of groundwater fed by a recharge zone in the hills to the northeast, moving through a layer of porous limestone at a depth of approximately 60 to 90 feet below the surface. The output of the system was, in Dr. Ferris's words, considerable and consistent. The water quality, from the samples he had analyzed, was exceptional, cold, mineral-rich, and clean in a way that surface water in the county was not. At the letter's end, Dr. Ferris had recommended that Elias register the water rights formally and consult a land attorney about the implications of the discovery for any existing or future agreements concerning the property. Elias had taken that advice seriously. The next document in the stack was a letter from a Pikeville attorney named Graves, dated June 1941, advising Elias that under Kentucky water law the natural artesian system was his to claim and register, provided no prior agreement had ceded those rights. The letter then noted, and this was where Carol stopped and read the sentence twice, that a mineral and resource agreement signed in 1919 by one Harold Sutton, Elias's father, contained language that Mountain Valley Resource Partners had argued extended to water resources as well as mineral extraction. The attorney believed this interpretation was wrong. The language of the 1919 agreement, he wrote, was specific to mineral extraction and did not meet the legal standard required to transfer water rights. But he cautioned that settling the matter would likely require litigation, since the company would not release a claim of that value voluntarily. The 1919 agreement was in the box, 3 pages, handwritten, and then typed in the manner of legal documents from that era, signed at the bottom by Harold Sutton in a signature that leaned heavily to the right. Carol read it twice. The language referred specifically to mineral deposits and extraction operations. It said nothing about water. It mentioned nothing about aquifer systems or natural springs. Not one word. Elias Sutton had spent the winter of 1943 in his cellar assembling all of this. The survey, the geologist's letter, the attorney's analysis, the original 1919 agreement with its critical gap. Additional pages beneath those, a second letter from Dr. Ferris in 1942 with updated measurements of the aquifer's output. A sworn statement, notarized in Pikeville, from a neighboring landowner confirming he had observed the lower orchard section remaining wet through the droughts of 1939 and 1940, when everything around it was dry. He had built a case document by document, organized it, wrapped it in oilcloth, and locked it in a drawer set into the wall of his cellar. He had put the key in the water reservoir of his stove in the water above the water that someone had tried to take from him. And he had gone to the circuit court in 1945 and laid it all out, and the court had ruled in his favor, and the company's claim had died there. And then Elias Sutton had died in 1961, and Harlan Sutton had inherited the land and eventually died too. And Vera Sutton had bought the property in 1983 and tended it for 41 years and never cleaned the stove reservoir quite all the way to the bottom, or had found the key and understood something about it that she had chosen to leave for whoever came after her. Carol sat on the cellar floor for a long time after she finished reading. Then she reached for the first cloth bag and untied the cord at its neck. Inside, each one wrapped individually in a square of oilcloth, were coins. Gold coins heavy and cool against her fingers when she unwrapped the first one. A double eagle, $20 in face value, larger than a modern quarter, with Liberty on the obverse and an eagle on the reverse, the date 1910 stamped below the image. She set it on the floor beside her and unwrapped the next. 1924. A St. Gaudens double eagle, its surfaces carrying the soft luster of gold that had spent decades sealed away from the air. She went through all 3 bags methodically. 31 coins in total. All double eagles, all gold, ranging in date from 1907 to 1932, each wrapped individually, each protected by oilcloth and iron and the cold dry air of the sealed drawer for more than 60 years. Several of them, even without any expertise in coins, she could see were in remarkable condition, surfaces clean, the fine details of the engraving still sharp, the kind of preservation that comes only from decades of careful storage. She arranged them in a row on the cellar floor and counted them twice. She did not know their value precisely. She knew what gold traded for in a general way. She knew that old coins in good condition carried premiums above their metal content. She did not know, sitting on the floor of this cellar in May, what 31 well-preserved St. Gaudens and Liberty Head double eagles were worth to a collector or at auction. But she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from having had very little for a stretch of time, that the number was not going to be small. She photographed everything with her phone, the coins in their row, each coin individually, the documents, page by page, the survey, the geologist's letters, the attorney's analysis, the 1919 agreement with its missing language, the interior of the drawer and its oilcloth lining, the iron plate from outside, the keyhole at its center. Then she wrapped everything carefully back, replaced the oilcloth, and went upstairs. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the orchard for a long time. Then she called Mavis Chun. She told Mavis what she had found. There was a silence on the other end of the line that went on long enough for Carol to check that the call hadn't dropped, and then Mavis said, very quietly, "Carol, don't touch anything else until you talk to a lawyer." Carol said she thought that was right. She drove to Pikeville the following morning and found an attorney named Susan Ballard whose practice focused on land and water rights in eastern Kentucky. Susan's office had framed survey maps on 3 of its 4 walls and a coffee maker that ran continuously. Carol sat across the desk from her and laid out what she had found, document by document, photograph by photograph. Susan read the geologist's letters and the 1919 agreement and the circuit court summary that Carol had printed from the library archive, and when she was done she set her reading glasses on the desk and looked across at Carol with an expression that was not quite surprise. "The water rights are yours," she said. The 1945 ruling settled the resource claim. What it also did, and this may not have been fully understood at the time, because water rights law was less developed then, was established that the 1919 agreement had no claim on the aquifer because the agreement's language didn't cover it. Those water rights were never transferred. They've been attached to this deed since the beginning. Carol asked what that meant in practical terms. Susan picked up her pen and turned it over in her fingers once. "It means you own the water," she said. "And in eastern Kentucky, in the current market, that water is worth considerably more than the land it's sitting under." The geological survey took 3 weeks. A team from a Lexington firm spent 2 days on the lower orchard section with equipment Carol watched without fully understanding instruments that measured what was happening 60 feet below the surface, test points drilled with a precision that left the surrounding ground almost undisturbed. They were efficient and professional and told her nothing until the report arrived by email 17 days later. The aquifer was intact. The output was, if anything, higher than Dr. Ferris's 1941 estimate. His measurements had been taken from the surface, and the modern instruments measured from below with greater accuracy. The water quality was exceptional, cold, clean, and mineral balanced in a way that, the lead geologist told her over the phone, was increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. The recharge zone was stable. The system would continue producing indefinitely, provided extraction did not exceed the recharge rate, a constraint the report quantified carefully and clearly. The estimated value of the water rights, based on comparable sales in the region under current Kentucky law, $1.4 million. Carol read the number 3 times. Then she set the phone down on the pine table and looked at it for a while. The numismatist came from Lexington on a Thursday morning. Gerald Home was a compact, deliberate man who brought a loupe and a set of small instruments and spent 4 hours at the pine table working through the 31 coins with the focused care of someone who has learned not to show his reactions until he is ready to give his conclusion. Carol made tea and sat across from him and watched without interrupting. He said very little while he worked. When he finished, he set his loupe down, folded his hands, and looked at the coins arranged before him in their groups. 12 St. Gaudens double eagles, he said. 4 of them grade MS, 63 or better. That is exceptional for coins stored outside a professionally controlled environment, even a cold and dry one. He moved through the Liberty heads next, citing dates and grades in the same level, measured tone. When he arrived at his overall estimate, he gave it as a range, as numismatists always do, because the final price depends on the buyer and the market and the particular day. The low end was $114,000. The high end was $161,000. Carol sat at Vera's pine table and looked at 31 gold coins and thought about a kitchen chair bought for $6 at a Salvation Army on Campbell Street in Harlan. Word traveled, as it always does in small regions, without anyone specifically intending it to travel in any particular direction. The geological survey team had been visible from the main road on both days of their work. Earl Perkins heard about it from the equipment driver, who had stopped in Dorton for gas. Earl mentioned it in passing to 2 people over the following week. One of those people worked near someone at the Pike County Assessor's office. The assessor's office had received, some months earlier, an inquiry about the Sutton property from an attorney in Harlan on behalf of an unnamed client. The assessor called Susan Ballard's office. Susan Ballard called Carol. When the assessor arrived at the farmhouse for an informal updated evaluation, he came with a colleague and a printed copy of the geological report, which had apparently been making its way through the county's professional circles in the quiet, persistent way of information that changes what people thought they knew. The assessor was a methodical man named Terrence who had evaluated properties in Pike County for 22 years. He reviewed the geological report and the coin valuation summary and copies of Elias Sutton's 1941 documents that Susan had advised Carol she could share. He said very little while he read. When he finished, he looked up and said, with the particular economy of a professional who does not editorialize, we'll need to do a full updated assessment. The prior valuation didn't account for the water rights. He did not mention that the prior valuation had described the property's marketable value as difficult to determine. He did not need to. The updated assessment, 6 weeks later, placed the total value of the property farmhouse, barn, orchard in its current state of recovery, 43 acres, and the registered water rights at approximately $1.8 million. She found out that Richard had learned about it on a Tuesday. Allison called, not to deliver information this time, but because she needed to process something, her voice carrying the slightly winded quality of someone who has had the ground shifted under them without warning. She said her father had seen something she wasn't sure through which channel, possibly through the attorney who had made the inquiry to the assessor, possibly through the Harlan Contracting Network, possibly through Fitzgerald, who apparently still heard things about former clients. She said her father had called her after he found out, and he had been. She paused here, searching quiet. Not angry, just very quiet. Carol listened without speaking. He asked me, Allison said, if you had known about the water when you took the land in the divorce. Carol thought about a Saturday morning in late April. She thought about standing at the property line looking at pale, exhausted trees and a barn with a bent hinge and a door she hadn't wanted to open yet. She thought about the cellar smell coming up from below, cold and damp and biological. No, she said. I didn't know anything about the water. I just didn't think the land was worthless. Allison was quiet for a moment. Then she said, slowly, as if laying it out for herself as much as for Carol, he had it assessed. His lawyer had it assessed during the divorce proceedings. And it came back as difficult to determine, Carol said. And he decided it wasn't worth fighting for. A pause. Mom, he's been telling people it was unfortunate. He said that to me. 3 months ago, he called this an unfortunate situation for you. Carol looked out the kitchen window. The orchard was in full leaf now, the upper rows deep green and settled into summer. The lower section, the trees, she had nearly written off, showing a recovery the horticulturist she had brought in described as better than expected. Several of the oldest pear trees, the ones Vera had planted when she first arrived on the land, had come back. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to matter. I know he did, Carol said. Are you Allison stopped? Started again. How are you doing with all of this? Carol considered the question. She thought about Elias Sutton in the winter of 1943, working alone down in the cellar while a company's lawyers built their case in the courthouse, organizing his documents and wrapping his coins and putting the key where only the right kind of person would find it. She thought about the word that had traveled from Richard's mouth to the Harlan contracting community to a parking lot where a man had laughed at his own joke about swimming pools. She thought about the pear trees at the bottom of the slope that everyone, including her, had been ready to give up on. I'm good, she said, and she meant it in a way she had not meant anything in a very long time. She did not call Richard. The thought occurred to her and then moved through her without catching. She understood, without anyone having to tell her, that there was a version of this moment she could have wanted: the phone call, the quiet recitation of what had been found, the number from the assessor's report spoken plainly into the phone, the silence on the other end of it. She understood the appeal of that version. She also understood what it would cost her, and she did not want to spend it. The man who had laughed in the garden center parking lot about swimming pools ran a small landscaping operation on the east side of Harlan. He heard about the property through the same professional network that everything traveled through in that part of the county, and on a Sunday afternoon in late August he drove past the Sutton property because the road to it had become, apparently, a road that people drove past on Sundays now. Carol did not see him. She was in the lower orchard at the time, checking on a row of pear trees that the horticulturist had flagged for close watching through the summer. Earl Perkins told her about the Sunday drive on her next trip into Dorton. His face, when he said it, carried the small, contained satisfaction of a man who has watched the right thing happen and intends to leave it exactly where it is. Carol thanked him, bought a bag of fertilizer and a new pair of work gloves, and drove back to the property. The water rights negotiation ran through most of the autumn. Susan Ballard handled the formal process, but Carol was present at every meeting held in a conference room in Pikeville, attended by a representative from a regional water authority and later by a representative from a bottling company based in Berea that had been looking for a clean eastern Kentucky source for 2 years. Carol listened to everything and asked questions when she didn't understand the answers, and made 2 decisions that Susan advised her on and one she made on her own. The decision she made on her own was to retain a portion of the water rights. Specifically, she kept the spring-fed pond on the eastern edge of the property and the water access she was already using at the farmhouse. What she sold was the extraction rights to a defined volume from the aquifer's output, enough for the bottling company's projected operations, not enough to reduce the system's recharge rate. That constraint had been clear in the geological report, and Carol had been equally clear about it in the negotiations. The agreement took 4 months to finalize. When it was signed, it produced a settlement figure that Susan described as life-changing, which Carol had found both accurate and strange as a phrase, because the changing had already been happening for months without anyone signing anything. She cleared the medical debt Brent had carried since his appendix surgery the previous year. She did this without telling him she was going to, found out about it through something Allison had mentioned once in passing, and handled it through the billing office. Brent called her when the zero balance statement arrived and was quiet on the phone for a long time, and then said, "Mom, you didn't have to do that." She told him she had wanted to, which was true, and which seemed to be enough. She hired a horticulturist named Ray Combs, Pike County, 63 years old, 30 years working with apple and pear orchards, the kind of patience that comes from working with things that grow on their own schedule. Ray assessed every tree in the lower flood section individually and identified 12 that were past recovery and 41 that were not, and he drew up a replanting plan that accounted for the orchard's drainage patterns and the aquifer below. The water table in the lower section, properly understood now, was an advantage. He told her the root systems of the oldest surviving trees had been reaching toward it for decades, which was part of why several of them had come back after 11 days underwater when younger trees in worse drained ground might not have. New trees went in alongside the recovering ones in October, a heritage pear variety that Vera had apparently favored, identified from a faded tag Ray found on one of the oldest standing trees. They were small. They would take years before they produced anything meaningful. Carol planted them anyway, working alongside Ray through 2 cold October mornings, tamping the soil around each root ball and staking each young trunk against the wind. She asked Earl Perkins, in December, whether he thought she should donate Elias Sutton's documents to a county historical archive. Earl considered this for a moment and then said, "Those documents save the land. I'd keep them with the land." Carol agreed with him. She had the drawer cleaned and properly resealed, the iron plate polished to something close to its original condition. The key, after she had a copy made at the Dorton hardware store, went on a small hook beside the cellar door where she would see it every time she passed through the kitchen. The copy she kept in her pocket. On a Saturday morning in late November, when the first hard cold had settled over the county and the orchard stood bare against a pale sky, Carol went down to the cellar in the early morning light. She stood in front of the iron plate and held her flashlight on it, on the keyhole at its center, on the masonry surrounding it that Elias Sutton had laid by hand in 1918 and had returned to in the winter of 1943 when someone tried to take what was his. She thought about him down here alone, in the cold, organizing his papers and wrapping his coins one by one, working with the particular focus of a man who knows that what he is building has to be enough to outlast him. She thought about the word he had written on the envelope. To whoever stays. He had not known who it would be. He could not have imagined Carol Whitmore, 56 years old, 3 boxes in a CRV, a checking account balance that looked like a countdown pulling up to the edge of his land on a Saturday in April and standing at the property line long enough to decide to walk toward the house rather than back to the car. He had not addressed the envelope to anyone specific because the specific person did not matter. What mattered was the quality of the staying. The willingness to go into the cellar and treat the mold wall by wall and reach to the bottom of the reservoir and not leave when things were hard. Vera had stayed 41 years and had left the land to Carol without explanation. Carol had come to believe that Vera had not known about the coins or the documents, that the key at the bottom of the reservoir had sat through decades of Vera's mornings without being found, or had been found and set aside without being recognized for what it was. But Vera had known something else. Something that no assessor's report could quantify and no legal document could describe. She had known the land was worth staying for. She had left it to someone she believed would understand that. The drawer behind the iron plate was unlocked now, and had been since the morning Carol opened it, because there was nothing left inside it that needed protecting in that way. What had needed safeguarding had done its work. What had needed finding had been found. What had been sealed for over 60 years was open now, and it was going to stay open, because Carol was going to stay. She switched off the flashlight and stood in the dark of the cellar for a moment. The land above her was bare and cold, and heading into its 3rd winter since the flood. The orchard stood empty-branched. The new trees in the lower section were small and needed one more cold season before they would be anything other than young stakes in the ground. The farmhouse chimney needed its gap properly repaired in the spring, a real repair, not a patch. The porch required new framing at its southeast corner. There was always the next thing. There was always more work ahead than behind. She switched the flashlight back on and went up the stairs. She put the kettle on the iron stove. Outside the west-facing kitchen windows, the bare canopy of the upper orchard caught the thin November light and held it for a moment in the very tips of the branches, just the outermost growth, just the ends of things, bright against the gray sky. The kettle came to a boil. She made her tea and carried it to the pine table and sat in the chair she had been sitting in every morning since May. Elias Sutton had built this table in this room because he had intended to be in this room for a long time. Vera Sutton had sat at it for 41 years. Carol wrapped both hands around the warm cup and looked out through the west windows at the orchard she had been given and the orchard she had planted in the ground between the rows where the roots were doing their slow, invisible, essential work. Somewhere in the upper trees, a bird she still had not learned to name called once into the cold morning air. Then it went quiet, the way things do when they have said what they needed to say. Carol drank her tea and listened to the house around her. She was not going anywhere. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.